The ground trembled with the roar of armies. Men fell. Blood soaked the soil. The cries of the wounded and dying filled the air, mixing with the clash of swords and the screams of horses. No one remembered their names. No one survived intact. These were not stories told in history books. These were the horrors deliberately forgotten. The stench of battle lingered for days. Limbs, weapons, and courage lost together under the sun. Some fought for glory. Some fought to survive. Most fought in silence, swallowed by chaos. This is what truly happened on the forgotten battlefields of the ancient world. Dawn broke over the hills, casting pale light over the armies lined in tense formation. Soldiers polished armor, sharpened weapons, and whispered prayers to gods who might not hear them. The air was thick with anticipation, and every heartbeat echoed like a drum. Ancient battlefields were not just fields, they were stages of fate. The men who stood there knew that today could be their last sunrise. Families and villages behind them waited in fear, while commanders calculated strategy with cold precision. Yet no plan could account for the chaos that awaited. The soldiers' expressions were a mix of determination, dread, and silent resignation. Some whispered to one another, sharing last words. Others looked skyward, silently begging for protection. The clink of metal, the snapping of armor, and the restless murmur of tens of thousands created a surreal tension. Horses stamped, dust swirled, and the wind carried the distant cries of scouts reporting enemy movements. Every soldier understood that the coming hours would test not only skill and courage but also endurance and the will to survive. And then the first horn blew. The quiet shattered. Spears clashed. Arrows darkened the sky. The battle began. Chaos erupted. Dust and blood mingled in the air. Men who had trained their whole lives found themselves swallowed by violence they could neither predict nor control. This was the beginning of a nightmare no history scroll fully captured. The brave, the foolish, and the unlucky were thrust into a storm where the only certainty was death, pain, and the unknown. And even in victory, survivors would carry scars unseen by history. The battlefield became a living nightmare. Metal screamed as swords met shields, arrows whistled through the air, and the ground trembled beneath the charge of cavalry. Chaos ruled. There was no time for fear, only reaction, fight or die. Soldiers fell in seconds. Some were struck down instantly, their bodies crumpling into the dust. Others were trapped under fallen comrades or crushed beneath the hooves of panicked horses. The cries of the wounded echoed across the battlefield, mingling with the shouts of commanders and the clash of weapons. Blood stained the soil, darkening it into a mud of death and despair. Amid the carnage, survival demanded instinct. Soldiers abandoned strategy, relying on raw reflexes. A shield raised just in time. A leap aside to avoid a spear. Yet even the most skilled could be overwhelmed. Panic spread like wildfire, and formation broke apart under the relentless pressure of the enemy. The battlefield was not a fair contest. It was a test of endurance, pain tolerance, and sheer luck. Fear was constant, driving men to fight harder, flee faster, or freeze in place. The sounds of battle, groans, screams, clanging metal, and the cries of horses, created a disorienting symphony that numbed the senses and blurred reality. Amid the chaos, some acts of heroism emerged. A soldier shielding comrades from a volley of arrows. A small group holding a position against impossible odds. But these moments were fleeting, swallowed by the overwhelming tide of death. By midday, the field was unrecognizable. Bodies lay tangled with weapons, horses stumbled over fallen men, and survivors staggered, exhausted and dazed. There was no glory here, only the relentless, brutal truth of what ancient battles demanded. The dead and dying were countless, yet the living would continue, carrying memories of horrors that no history scroll dared fully recount. Amid the chaos of battle, the wounded were often left to suffer. Ancient armies had no medics as we know them today. A broken limb, a deep cut, or a punctured chest could mean death if the soldier couldn't crawl away. Blood-soaked armor, clothing, and dirt alike, and every movement caused agony. Those who survived the initial clash often faced a new terror: capture. Prisoners of war were not simply held, they were at the mercy of enemies who decided their fate, sometimes brutally. Some were enslaved, forced into labor, or marched across vast distances with little food or water. Others were executed as a warning to deter rebellion. For many, survival after the battle was no less deadly than the fight itself. Hunger, exposure, and disease claimed countless more than swords or spears. Infected wounds festered. Thirst parched the throat. Cold nights chilled men to the bone. The battlefield became a limbo of pain, where those still breathing clung to life with desperate resolve. Even amid despair, glimpses of humanity remained. A soldier might shield a comrade from a falling horse. Strangers offered water or whispered encouragement. Acts of mercy were rare, but they existed, tiny islands of hope in a sea of suffering. Yet the scale of loss was immense. Fields that had once been green now lay littered with the dead. The earth itself seemed to mourn. Survivors wandered dazed, haunted by screams, sights of bloodied bodies, and the knowledge that they had been spared by chance rather than skill. On these forgotten battlefields, death and survival were inseparable. The fallen became part of the soil, and the survivors carried invisible scars that would last a lifetime. History remembered the victors, but it rarely acknowledged the silent suffering of the thousands who endured the horrors of war. Surviving the battlefield was only half the struggle. The mind bore wounds that the body could not always reveal. Fear, trauma, and grief clung to soldiers long after the fighting ended. The cries of the dead haunted dreams, and the memory of comrades falling under blade or arrow replayed endlessly. Many soldiers experienced shock, paralysis in the midst of chaos, trembling hands, or a mind that could not process what had happened. Others became hyper-alert, unable to rest even in relative safety. Anxiety and panic were constant companions, eroding morale and weakening even the strongest warriors. Commanders understood the value of fear. Discipline was enforced not only on the battlefield but in camp and march. The threat of punishment kept soldiers in line, but it also compounded their mental strain. Soldiers feared both the enemy and their own leaders. Obedience became a shield against survival, a way to navigate the relentless pressure. Yet, amid the darkness, resilience persisted. Bonds formed between comrades, forged in blood and shared terror. Stories were told at night, songs hummed quietly, and small acts of bravery and kindness reminded men of their humanity. Even the smallest gesture, a shared piece of bread, a helping hand, a whispered word of encouragement, could restore hope, if only briefly. For those who survived, the battlefield's psychological scars lingered for life. Flashbacks, nightmares, and emotional numbness haunted veterans. Communities of soldiers became essential for survival, providing support and shared understanding in a world that could not fully comprehend their experiences. War was more than combat. It was a trial of endurance, morality, and spirit. The horrors of ancient battlefields extended far beyond the clash of weapons, shaping minds and lives in ways history seldom records. Those who lived carried invisible burdens, a legacy of terror and resilience that time cannot erase. As the dust settled, the battlefield became eerily silent. Weapons lay scattered, broken shields bore the marks of countless blows, and the earth was littered with the bodies of the fallen. Victory might have been claimed, but it came at a price too high for any crown or general to measure. Survivors wandered among the dead, some searching for friends or comrades, others haunted by memories too heavy to bear. The air was thick with the smell of blood and decay, mingling with the iron tang of sweat and fear. Each step forward was a negotiation between exhaustion, grief, and the will to live. For those taken prisoner, life continued in hardship. Forced marches, labor, and harsh treatment awaited them. Many did not survive long enough to see the next sunrise. Others adapted, learning to navigate captivity with cunning and caution, preserving what dignity they could. Survival became a game of endurance, patience, and subtle defiance. And yet, even amid death and suffering, the human spirit persisted. Soldiers shared stories, preserved memory, and created bonds that defied the chaos around them. Songs were hummed softly at night. Tales of courage and resilience were whispered in hidden corners. In these acts, no matter how small, hope survived where history would later forget. Ancient battlefields were more than sites of bloodshed, they were theaters of human struggle, courage, and horror. The dead were countless, the survivors scarred, and the lessons often unrecorded. History remembers only victories, triumphs, and leaders, but the silent suffering, bravery, and endurance of ordinary soldiers remain buried, waiting to be acknowledged. The forgotten horrors of ancient battlefields teach us that war is never glorious. It is a brutal test of endurance, morality, and spirit. And those who lived in body and mind carried stories that history too often left untold.